Welcome to Stax, Soulsville, USA. So, Stax Records is often compared to Motown because they have so many similarities. They're both producing music in the same time throughout the 1960s. They're both indie labels, and they both have 100% African American artists recording their music. Unlike Motown, which was up in Detroit, Michigan, Stax Records is down in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee isn't usually thought of as a center for music, but really two of the most important labels in rock history are centered in Memphis, Tennessee. Sun Records, home of early Elvis, Chet Atkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, Roy Orbison, Johnny Cash, and then of course Stax Records as well. One of the ideas that we'll explore during this lecture is the relationships between Stax in Memphis and Atlantic, another indie label up in New York City. We've talked about Atlantic plenty of times before, home of Tom Dowd, the producer and sound engineer who received the second Octopus, the second 8-track recording device. Motown experienced success very quickly. For Stax, it was a little more of a slow burn. They were building and building and building throughout the 1960s, and by the time we get to the 1970s, they're actually a major player in the field. Stax has the nickname Soulsville, USA, for two reasons. Number one, it's a play on Motown's nickname of Hitsville, USA. They were saying, yeah, Motown releases the hits, but we release the music with soul. And I talked about in the sweet soul discussion that just like rock, soul is a large genre with multiple subgenres. The earliest is now known as sweet soul. Think back to Stand By Me by Ben E. King, some Nat King Cole, that kind of music. Well, now we're transitioning from that style, which focused on stringed instruments and these Latin feels, to Southern soul. Southern soul is known for its enthusiastic music, sort of unbuttoned. It's not quite so nice and neat and trimmed. Again, back with sweet soul, all the guys had on suits, and now, yeah, they have suits, but they've taken the tie off, they've unbuttoned the shirts, not just figuratively, but literally. It has a very obvious gospel influence that you can hear right on the surface of the music that was not there with sweet soul. It's often referred to as spontaneous and raw. And when we say spontaneous, we mean just use of improvisation, that there are certain musical elements that are decided in the moment by the musicians that weren't necessarily planned out, much like a gospel worship service. And it may be considered raw, the sound, the raw as in raw emotion, raw power, but still very much refined in terms of the recording techniques and process. Let's go back to someone we've talked about in an earlier lecture. This is Jerry Wexler. Now, Jerry Wexler is the head of Atlantic. In addition to producing his own artists, he realizes he can make money by licensing songs from smaller indie labels. So this is what Sun Records was doing back with Sam Phillips and Rocket 88. He would record the music, but he didn't have the infrastructure at Sun Records to really handle the business side as well as it could have been done. So he licensed the music to Chess Records, which was still another indie label, but more established and had greater resources, would then release the music. Well, that's what Jerry Wexler decides to do. He's going to find small indie labels who are producing great music, but don't have the infrastructure to release it, and he's going to release it as a partnership with those indie labels. Through doing this, Jerry Wexler and Atlantic are able to turn regional hits into national hits. Now, one of the first things we talked about in the very first lecture is the way radio, as early as the 1920s, was able to transform the music industry from regional into national. Well, yes, that's true, and we are in the 1960s now, 40 years later, but it's still true that small groups weren't able to get their music out. Small labels weren't able to get their music out. There was no streaming. The only way you were going to get your records into a record store is to drive them to the record store and ask them to sell them. The only way you're going to get your music on the radio is to drive to that radio station and convince them to play it through payola arrangements or just because they're good guys and they love the sound of the music. So while it's true that we do have a national audience, very small labels are still unable to get their music out in a big way. But because of Jerry Wexler at Atlantic, he's able to help Stax Records do just that. Stax Records was founded by two people, Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton, and the name Stax comes from taking the first two letters of Stewart, ST, and the first two letters of Axton, AX. Put it together, you get Stax Records. It should be noted that while Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson were African American, Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton were white. That's actually going to become a relevant part of the story at the end of this lecture. Well, as I've already mentioned, this was centered in Memphis, Tennessee. They licensed and distributed their music through Atlantic, and through doing so, created this close relationship with Jerry Wexler, the head of Atlantic, and Tom Dowd, the sound engineer. Tom Dowd, who at this point is considered a superstar in the industry, one of the greatest sound engineers in all of music during the 1950s and 60s, decides that if Atlantic is going to be licensing this music from Stax, the music has to be great. And he hears that there's a lot of talent and a lot of great music, but it doesn't sound that good. The recording techniques they're using are a bit unsophisticated, and they're not quite as refined as they would hope. So what Tom Dowd does, this master sound engineer, is he actually travels down to Memphis, Tennessee, and he redesigns and renovates the Stax studio so that after his renovations, it is absolutely state-of-the-art despite its small size. Sometimes when you're looking up the music from these Stax artists, you'll see that it's credited as either being by Volt or Stax Volt. Volt was a subsidiary of Stax. It's just the same group of people, music coming out of the same building, but just sometimes they would use different names for it. So if you see Volt or Stax Volt, it's all Stax. I already mentioned that Stax and Motown are often compared to one another, but Stax and Motown are often depicted as being opposites and contradictory, but I will argue that they actually have many similarities, as does your textbook author. For example, Stax had in-house songwriters, notably Isaac Hayes, David Porter, Steve Cropper, and Otis Redding. These four men are responsible for writing some of the greatest songs of the 1960s, and I know you've already heard a lot of them, even if you didn't know who the songwriters were, but you may also be familiar with Isaac Hayes as the voice of Chef on South Park. Just like Los Angeles had the Wrecking Crew and Motown had the Funk Brothers, Stax also has their own in-house studio musicians, Booker T and the MGs, led by Booker T. One thing that Booker T and the MGs of Stax Records can claim that the Wrecking Crew cannot, nor can the Funk Brothers, is they actually had their own instrumental hit, a song that they produced and recorded on their own, no vocalists, just the studio musicians. It's a song, I know you've all heard it before, it's called Green Onions. But just because you've heard it doesn't mean you recognize the name. I've worked with a little over 300 different private guitar students, and the book I like to use teaches Green Onions very early in the lessons series. And one question I started asking these students is, do you recognize this song by its name, Green Onions? And I've had one person out of over 300 students, one person says, of course I recognize Green Onions. Every other student I've worked with has said, no, I don't think I've ever heard that. And then I play the song for them, and one student still said, no, I've never heard that before. Every other student has said, oh yeah, I've heard that 100 times. So it's a really famous song. You may not know the name, you may not recognize Booker T and the MGs, or at least you didn't before this class, but I bet you do recognize the song Green Onions. Another way that Booker T and the MGs are a little bit different than the Wrecking Crew and the Funk Brothers is the Wrecking Crew and the Funk Brothers would both help arrange songs. Songwriters would come in with a song that was finished, but they would help figure out what should the guitar play? What kind of beat should the drums play? Maybe we should change the vocal harmony here. Those two groups would help with the arrangement. At Stax, Booker T and the MGs would actually help write the songs. That's pretty special. And lastly, within Booker T and the MGs, not only do they have great guitar player, great organ player, bass player, drummer, all the standard instruments that you would expect from studio musicians, but their horn sections, their trumpets, trombones, saxophones, their horn sections are so good, they're called the Stax horns, and they are actually hired out independent from Booker T and the MGs to go record on other people's music. We'll talk about that more today as well. Let's now discuss some of Stax performing artists. The first one I'd like to address is Otis Redding. Otis Redding was actually signed to Stax, and that's noteworthy because I mentioned this relationship that Stax has with Atlantic. A few of the artists we'll talk about today recorded with Stax, but were actually signed to Atlantic Records. Otis Redding was signed to Stax Records. One of his earliest hits was called Respect from 1965. The song would later be covered by Aretha Franklin, but it was Otis Redding's original song. Otis Redding and Stax in general did very well on the pop charts. They did find success, but I should point out now that Motown was always just a little bit more successful, kind of like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones in the 1960s. The Rolling Stones were very successful, but the Beatles were always more successful. That's kind of the relationship that Motown and Stax have. Now, there are plenty of other ways to measure success other than how songs do on the charts, but for what it's worth, Motown did chart better than Stax, generally speaking. But what's interesting about that is that even though Motown did better in that regard, many musicians who came after this time period cite Stax as being more influential on them as musicians and their musical career. The next song by Otis Redding I'll draw your attention to is called Try Little Tenderness, and this is from the next year, 1966. This song is really great because It starts off with this kind of slow romantic feel, and then at the very end, it really kicks into high gear and becomes this really exciting song. It comes in a very unexpected but very cool way. So make sure you listen to that one all the way to the end and pay attention for that dramatic shift in personality and tone within that song. Later this unit, I'm going to discuss 3 important music festivals that happened in the 1960s. One of them is called the Monterey Pop Festival. I'll get into more detail about that in a later lecture that really focuses on it, but I do want to say that this was a festival that focused on pop and rock music, featured a lot of white artists. Most of the audience members were white, but Otis Redding booked a gig to play at this Monterey Pop Festival. And a lot of people were surprised when this African-American guy gets up with his soul band. That's just not the kind of music that was played at this festival, but it was an absolutely huge hit. And Otis Redding then became really popular, not only with the African-American community, but also with the white pop and rock community. So Otis Redding was the first Stax musician to really experience significant crossover success with both African-American and white audiences. And it's not just that they were white audiences, but they were white hippie audiences. We'll talk more about hippies in the final part of this unit, but it's worth noting that one of their favorite artists was this soul artist down from Memphis, Tennessee, Otis Redding. At age 26, in 1967, Otis Redding tragically dies in a plane crash. However, right before he died, he had recorded a song. This song was called Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, and it was released in 1968 posthumously, the year after Otis Redding died. This song was his absolute biggest hit yet, and in many ways it seems representative of his life, and in some ways the civil rights movement, which by 1968 was in full swing. So as you listen to that song, keep that part of the story in mind, and I think you'll find that the message of the music is even more profound and powerful with that context. As you can imagine, 3 hit songs, playing the Monterey Pop Festival, Otis Redding is a big act for Stax, and his death leaves a hole in the Stax lineup that they need to fill with other artists who can fill that space. 2 men who help do that are a singing duo by the name of Sam and Dave. Sam and Dave were signed to Atlantic, but on loan to Stax. I mentioned that some artists had that arrangement. They worked very closely with the Stax songwriters, specifically Isaac Hayes and Dave Porter. Their 2 most popular songs are undeniably Hold On, I'm Coming from 1966 and Soul Man from 1967, which was a hit for the Blues Brothers as well in the early 1980s. Now that first song I mentioned, Hold On, I'm Coming, I think is so representative of the Stax sound. As I mentioned, Southern soul, enthusiastic, unbuttoned, gospel influence, spontaneous, and just raw emotion and power in music. For that reason, I've included a relatively long video, live performance of Hold On, I'm Coming from Sam and Dave in the 1960s. I think this video is so helpful in showing you what Stax music was all about that we're actually going to watch it in its entirety right now.
of gin. I wonder, can you do that for me this evening? If you know what I'm talking about, do me a favor before I go. Do me a favor before I go. Do me a favor. Will you do me a favor? Yeah. Do me a favor. 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 Yeah. Stand on up. Stand on up. Hold on. Stand on up. Hold on. Stand on up. Hold on. Stand on up. Stand on up. Stand on up. Have a good time. Have a good time. Got to hold on.
The next artist we'll talk about is a man by the name of Wilson Pickett. So Wilson Pickett, like Sam and Dave, was also signed to Atlantic, but recorded music at Stax and worked with their songwriters and their band, Booker T and the MGs. His first big hit was called In the Midnight Hour from 1965. The song is actually adapted from a Christian gospel work that uses the verse, Jesus comes to me in the midnight hour. That was the inspiration for the song. It has what's called a delayed backbeat. So if you think about music, think the snare drum has to be here, the bass drum has to be here, that there's a specific point in time when we expect to hear these instruments. That's true. But if you imagine looking at this music digitally, like in Pro Tools or Logic, on some kind of music recording software on your computer, and you can zoom in the music, zoom in, stretch time until you're very close, and normally 1 second would be represented by this much, but then 1 second is represented by this much, and then 1 second, etc., right? You're just zooming in on the music. If I were to move the snare drum over, super zoomed in, right? Like this is 1 second. If I were to move the snare drum over from here to here, you're not really going to notice. It's still within this general spectrum of considered the right place and time, even though it did technically move forward or backward a little bit. Because of that concept, you can actually play the snare drum or the bass drum or any part of the rhythmic elements of this music a little earlier or a little later, still being right, still being within this general area of where the beat should go, but those subtle differences in placement change the feel of it. The Beatles are known for having the beat being very forward. It's almost like they're pushing it forward. It has this sense of building momentum even though the time isn't changing. Wilson Pickett and many other artists from Stax do the opposite. They do this delayed backbeat, which means the hits from the rhythmic instruments are still generally where they should be, but they're just a little behind while still being right. And that creates this really kind of laid back, smooth, cool feel. See if you can hear that on In the Midnight Hour. Well, one of the mysteries of rock is what happened between Wilson Pickett and Jim Stewart, one of the two founders of Stax. Something happened, we don't know what, but they had a falling out, some kind of really intense disagreement. And Jim Stewart said to Wilson Pickett, "I forbid you from recording at Stax." Well, Wilson Pickett still had a hit. So Jerry Wexler at Atlantic says, "Listen, we have to keep you recording music, even if Jim Stewart and you are no longer getting along." So what he does is he sends Wilson Pickett down to Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, a little bit south of Memphis, Tennessee. So Wilson Pickett works with Fame Studios as well as Quincy Studios, also down in Muscle Shoals, and he records the Percy Sledge song, "When a Man Loves a Woman." He releases this in 1966, another incredible hit for Wilson Pickett. Well, Rick Hall, one of the sound engineers down at Fame Studios, decides that they really want the Stax sound, so they hire the horn section, these Stax horns from Booker T and the MGs, and they pay them to drive down to Muscle Shoals and record. So even though it's not being produced at Stax, it's still the same company that hired Stax, the same performing artists who had success within the Midnight Hour, and now it's even some of the same musicians, just a short drive south. So it may not be Stax, but it sure sounds like it's Stax. Down in Muscle Shoals, they record and release Land of a Thousand Dances from 1966, as well as Mustang Sally, also from 1966. Wilson Pickett wasn't the only performer to play down in Muscle Shoals with Stax musicians as arranged by Jerry Wexler up at Atlantic in New York. Another performer who had the same arrangement was Aretha Franklin. Now, Aretha Franklin is known as the Queen of Soul, maybe the most important figure, at least in terms of enduring success that we'll talk about in this entire part of the unit on African American pop in the 1960s. She's late to the scene, but again, she has arguably the biggest success of them all. Her father was Reverend C.L. Franklin, who was one of these celebrity pastors out of the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan, which is where Motown is. That should be interesting that she's so close to Motown, but she doesn't end up recording there. Reverend Franklin would host these radio services that went out across the country, and his daughter Aretha Franklin sang in the choir. These choir performances were also featured on the radio. Because of her father's connections, Aretha Franklin met and had dinner with some of the biggest gospel singers of the time, and she really learned a lot from them along the way. She was originally signed with Columbia Records, but didn't experience any success with them. So finally, Jerry Wexler of Atlantic convinces Aretha Franklin to sign with Atlantic, marking yet another Jewish African-American Christian collaboration in the music business in the 1960s. In 1967, she recorded "I Never Loved a Man" at Fame Studio down in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. But again, some kind of nasty situation, some kind of confrontation took place, and they weren't able to finish the B-side. So they only recorded one song, even though they intended to record two. From that point on, Jerry Wexler calls Aretha Franklin. He says, "You know what? You're going to work exclusively from New York City." So Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, and people at this point are associating soul with Memphis, Tennessee, or Muscle Shoals, Alabama. She's actually recording in the heart of New York City. While Jim Stewart of Stax did have a problem with Wilson Pickett, he did not have any problem with Aretha Franklin. So he was happy to send Booker T and the MGs, which of course includes the Stax horn sections, on loan, so to speak, up to New York to record for Aretha Franklin. So she really is recording with the Stax musicians, Booker T and the MGs. Some of her hits that followed are "Respect" from 1967, as I mentioned, a cover from Otis Redding from 2 years earlier, "Think" from 1968, and "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman" from 1967, which was a song by Carole King and her husband Jerry Goffin, famous for the Brill Building. Carole King is going to record and release this song on her own in just a few years, but it was first a hit for Aretha Franklin, even though it was written by Carole King, and then Carole King would make it a hit a few years later. The same thing happened with Bob Dylan with "Blowin' in the Wind," first famous by Peter Paul and Mary, even though Bob Dylan wrote it, and then Bob Dylan had success with it after that. Despite Booker T and the MGs working with Aretha Franklin, she's not technically a Stax artist, but she's still emblematic of Southern soul. Now that we've discussed Stax records, let's talk about how Motown, Stax, the British Invasion, and the American response of folk rock led by Bob Dylan all relate to each other. So keep in mind, this was all happening at the same time. These were parallel movements in music. In February of 1964, the Beatles land in America, and Beatlemania is in full swing. It's all about British rock bands in the 1960s. But the next year, 1965, Bob Dylan and the Byrds are representing white America on the pop charts. It's still pretty much dominated by the Beatles, but Bob Dylan and the Byrds are finding success as Americans, as white Americans. Motown and Stax were able to represent Black Americans on the pop charts with their success in the 1960s. The white music of this time, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, the Byrds, we see some big changes to how music is recorded. With the Beatles, we see the self-contained band. With Bob Dylan, we see the singer-songwriter model. However, with both Motown and Stax, the more traditional music industry practices are still in place. The producer still has the same role as a producer. There are still studio musicians. There are still people who are songwriters and people who are producers. All of those roles remain intact in the African American pop scene. This relationship between these different genres really comes full circle when you keep in mind that the Beatles were covering many hits from Motown artists. So let's recap these similarities between Motown and Stax. There are three big ones I want you to keep in mind. Both had their own studio, both had their own devoted songwriters, and both had their own studio bands, like the Wrecking Crew. Motown had the Funk Brothers, and Stax Records had Booker T and the MGs. The last topic I'd like to address in this video is a conversation that was happening in the African American community in the 1960s while this music was coming out. The conversation they were having, the question they were asking is Stax blacker than Motown? It's a very controversial topic, so I'm just going to share with you some of the points of view that were brought up during that time. Well, there is this perception that Stax is blacker than Motown because of the style of music, for one. Remember, Motown was intentionally trying to appeal to white teenagers, whereas Southern Soul was really rooted so heavily in two genres, soul or sweet soul, which really got its start in the early 1960s, as well as traditional African American gospel music. So just based on those musical characteristics and seeing the performances, one might argue that you can understand why there was this perception that Stax was blacker than Motown. But the textbook author points out some counter arguments that also came from the African American community in the 1960s, which were that everyone at Motown was black, but Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton down at Stax were both white. And they were contracting and working with Atlantic Records, where everyone was white. So Motown was run completely by African Americans, whereas Stax was run completely by white Americans. As I mentioned in the previous video, at the height of its success, Motown was the most successful African American owned business in the country. Motown produced pop music and was really focused on crossover success, whereas Stax music really aimed to bring their music to the African American community. And yes, there were exceptions, like Otis Redding was really popular in the hippie movement among white Americans, but for the most part, African Americans were the primary audience of Stax Records, whereas Motown was bringing African American music to the white population. So in that sense, you could argue that Motown was doing more to spread African American music to everyone in America. All indications suggest that at Stax, they just weren't concerned with crossover success. So two questions to reflect on that were important topics in the African American community in the 1960s. The first is Stax blacker than Motown? But the second, a modern question to tie in with that discussion is that an unfair criticism for some of the reasons that I've just listed? I want you to consider those topics because Motown was accused by many in the African American community of selling out their blackness. There is, however, one man who was never accused of selling out his blackness, and that is James Brown, the godfather of soul, and the focus of the next video lecture. I'll see you then.